You're listening to part 2 of Our First Freedom, Disruption of Religious Liberty by John Litzler.
So as we're talking about modern applications of religious liberty and what that looks like in today's society, the next thing I think that's probably really appropriate and important for us to talk about is religious liberty as it interplays with the coronavirus. Because right now we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope it's the middle, and actually we hope it's nowhere near the end. But we're in the middle of that, and what are the rules for churches, and how does our freedom of religion interplay with the need for public safety? Again, going back to that analysis we talked about a moment ago of the government has a compelling public interest in safety. It actually happens to be aligned with the church's interest. We share that interest in safety and protection of our neighbors and the most vulnerable among us. But also the need to be able to worship and freedom of worship, and what does that look like, and what does that interplay look like? In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott has issued a series of executive orders. We're currently on Executive Order GA-26, and GA stands for Greg Abbott. And there's Executive Order GA-26, which is also kind of phase 3 of Texas reopening after our statewide lockdown and closure. And then there are these predecessor orders that came kind of before that. And in GA-26 and in each of the previous orders that covered this, Governor Abbott made an exception for churches. He made an exception for churches when it came to worship services. And he specifically said religious services are exempted from occupancy requirements and other restrictions and requirements. Even back when, before the governor's executive orders prohibited forcing people to wear masks, compelling people to wear masks, churches were exempted from that. They're exempted from social distancing requirement, all that kind of thing. Now, churches should still do those things. I'm not advocating that churches don't social distance and that people don't wear masks when they worship, or that they don't limit their occupancy in some way. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But we're exempt. And why are churches exempt? Governor Abbott said it's because of religious liberty. In fact, when some of the orders were criticized as being infringing too much upon religious liberty, Governor Abbott released a joint statement with the Attorney General providing guidance for houses of worship, and a separate document from the executive orders, making sure churches knew and understood that when it came to religious services, they were exempt, and outlining what that looked like. Now, that's in Texas, but not every state has promoted religious liberty in the same way, and that's not the case in a bunch of other states. Particularly, I've noticed in the news and the headlines that in Nevada, as they've reopened that state, Las Vegas has been allowed with their casinos to have a much higher capacity, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in the casinos, but there's a strict limit on churches of 50 people per gathering. And that limit isn't based on the churches or the church's size. For some people, for some churches, a smaller congregation or a smaller facility, 50 might really pack out that congregation. But what if you have a gigantic auditorium that could seat thousands, and to only be allowed to have 50 people in there? It doesn't seem fair, does it? It doesn't seem right. And so in some jurisdictions, some of these orders may violate religious liberty and religious freedom. Going back to our discussion about RFRA, yes, Nevada has a compelling interest in public safety and prohibiting the spread of COVID and trying to delay it as much as possible. But is a blanket rule of no more than 50 people, is that the least restrictive way of achieving that goal? Or could it be more narrowly tailored? For example, in Texas, Governor Abbott says 25% occupancy or 50% occupancy, something like that. Again, those occupancy requirements in Texas don't even apply. But if you follow the guidelines of leaving every other row of chairs or pews open and 6 feet between families, you're going to see a limited occupancy. And that seems so much more reasonable than just casinos can open with this much capacity, while churches can only open with this kind of capacity. And so we're gonna see in these types of issues with coronavirus that delicate interplay between the interest of public safety, preventing the spread of coronavirus, and in religious liberty and allowing churches to worship and that kind of thing. We're seeing it right now with the newest ordinance. There's in some counties, not every county, it's not a state order, but in Bexar County, where SABA is, in Bexar County, and then some other major counties, Harris County, Travis County, I think Dallas County, all have these new ordinances that are telling businesses, we're going to require businesses to have people wear masks, both their employees and their customers. And the language it actually uses is commercial entities. Now, I don't believe that those apply to churches, and it can be a little bit confusing because churches are commercial property. They're not residential property, so as opposed to a house or an apartment complex, they are commercial, but they're not commercial entities, right, as religious entities. Now, a nonprofit can be a commercial entity, but I don't believe churches are. But to the extent that they would be considered commercial entities, if they were to be, and if someone were trying to argue that this applied to churches, I think it would violate RFRA. I think it would violate the First Amendment. I think it would violate these state and federal protections that are in places for churches. And I think Governor Abbott would agree. And he's tried very hard to encourage churches to be safe and responsible without overstepping and intruding on religious liberty. So the coronavirus, how we wear masks, occupancy requirements, things like that, state orders, local orders from our county, all of those are modern day, right now, examples of how do we balance religious liberty with other interests and other rights. Religious liberty is an incredibly important freedom. Our First Amendment freedom is incredibly important. That's why we're calling this our first freedom. And it's going to create disruptions. Coronavirus is disruption, and trying to gather during coronavirus to practice our freedom of religion is a disruption right back. So it's going to create disruptions, but it's not an absolute freedom, right? As we already gave one example. It wouldn't give you the power to murder someone and say you had to do it because of your religion. So it may not be absolute. None of our freedoms are absolute, but it's our first, and it's arguably our most important of all the freedoms guaranteed us in our Constitution. There are a couple of pending Supreme Court cases I want to talk about. There are two pending Supreme Court cases that I want to talk about. One, actually, I've already talked about, which was the case pending from the Ninth Circuit that regarding employment. But I want to talk about two more that don't have anything to do with employment. These are separate cases. They're different. One is called the Espinoza versus the Montana Department of Revenue. And let me tell you a little bit about what's going on in Montana. This is a school voucher case. The state of Montana allows vouchers for schools. I don't know exactly how the system works, if it's like a tax credit or something like that, but essentially families can apply certain amount of dollars per kid to that kid attending a private school. And it's some type of voucher or credit type system. And the issue is that after this started, Montana said, hey, we have this statute, this rule, this in our Constitution called the Blaine Amendment, and it says this. It says we can't use state dollars, state tax dollars, and give them to a religious institution for any kind of reason. And so what you can't do is you can't use this school voucher program and apply it to a religious school. So yes, you can have school vouchers, but only for non-sectarian, schools. And so you can only use it for, like a charter type school that's a private school, or a non-religious private school, and it excluded private schools. And so there's a group of private schools in Montana that are saying you can't do that. That's discrimination based on our religious beliefs. You can't include some and not others. And so the real issue in the case is not whether Montana should have school vouchers or not. That's a completely separate conversation for Baptists about what we believe about the public school system and vouchers. And it's an important conversation, but not directly tied to what we're talking about today. The question is, if they're going to have school vouchers, can they exclude religious groups? Can they exclude churches from being a part of that? And so that's being considered by the Supreme Court right now in Montana. And that case is going to draw heavily on a previous case that was decided back in 2017 that you might remember. And that case was called Trinity Lutheran of Columbia v. Pauley. And what happened in that case, that was in Missouri, and there was Trinity Lutheran was a church with a playground, is a church with a playground. And Missouri had this program, this helpful program. They were going to recycle old tires. And so you paid part of a tax when you bought new tires. They taxed new tires. And part of that tax went to recycle the old tires to replace playgrounds with rubber so that kids weren't falling on gravel and scraping up their knees and not getting hurt as much. They recycled the rubber from those tires and made these safe, bouncy playground surfaces. And it was a great program, but they could only do a certain number of them. And so you had to apply. And only a certain number were going to receive this grant that came from these tax dollars to get these resurfaced playgrounds. And Trinity Lutheran applied, and they were rejected. Originally, they were accepted, and they made the cut, and they were going to get one. But then someone said, wait a second, this is a church, and it's a religious group, and we have a Blaine Amendment, just like Montana, that says we can't use government grants or tax dollars for religious organizations. And so we can't help Trinity Lutheran with this. And Trinity Lutheran said, it's a playground. It's not teaching kids religion, it's kids playing on a playground. You can't exclude us just because of our religious beliefs and just because we're a church. And the Supreme Court decided in that case 7-2, that's right, you can't exclude Trinity Lutheran from this grant program just because it's a church. Now, how much of that will be applied to Montana? We don't know. But in a 7-2 opinion, the Supreme Court decided with Trinity Lutheran, and so it seems likely that the court will also side with these private schools in Montana and tell Montana, if you're going to have a voucher program, you can't exclude religious organizations just because they're religious. And so that case is pending, and we're waiting that opinion. We might have it by the time you see this video. The Supreme Court is releasing opinions every week, and we could have word of that even as soon as next Monday. So we'll see on that. The other case I want you to be aware of is called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. And this has a lot to do with sexual orientation. And we just kind of had a conversation about it in an employment context. What does sex mean under Title VII? This is a similar type question, not with employment, but again with government dollars and also with government placements. Can the City of Philadelphia refuse to refer and place foster children with Catholic social services? And Catholic social services will not train foster parents that are in a same-sex relationship. So they will train married couples as foster parents, but they have to be a man and a woman in that relationship based on their religious beliefs. And Philadelphia said you can't do that. You know, that discriminates against people based on sexual orientation. And so if that's going to be your policy, we're not going to send you any more foster kids because we're not going to support you in that or participate in that. So we're not sending any more foster kids to you. And so a bunch of foster parents who were directly affected because they are no longer able to get foster children and help foster children through Catholic social services who they've been trained by and equipped by and licensed by. They're not getting those cases anymore. They sued. So that case is pending before the Supreme Court, and we're waiting to hear what the Supreme Court has to say about that case as well. An important case regarding religious liberty and the religious liberty of foster agencies and whether foster agencies can discriminate based on what they say. They're saying these are our religious beliefs. We're discriminating based on religious beliefs. You have to share our views on marriage and on sexuality in order for us to place foster kids with you. So that's an important case that's pending right now, and we're going to want to see how the Supreme Court rules on that. It will affect SABA churches and organizations here in Texas. You know, there is a fostering and orphan crisis, and we need foster parents. And in a lot of situations, churches are answering that call. They're training and equipping and coming alongside people in their congregations that want to foster. They're supporting organizations in our community that help with fostering and with adoption. And so this case is going to be really important to the religious effort, to the effort of our Baptist churches in helping with that. And then one other case that I think that's worth mentioning, this is not a pending case. We're done with the pending cases, but I want to talk about a case that's already been decided. It just got decided last year, and so I haven't had the opportunity to discuss it with you yet. And that is the case of the American Legion versus the American Humanist Association. And that was a 7-2 ruling in favor of keeping a cross up as a monument, as a memorial. And so I wanted to talk a little bit briefly about that, because what was an issue in that case was there was a cross. The cross was set up to honor, as a memorial, honor people who had died in World War I. And that cross was originally on private property, but then it became public property, got purchased by the government, became public property. And the American Legion had this cross, and it was being maintained. It was sitting on government property, and the American Humanist Association said, you can't do that. That is public dollars promoting something that is religious and maintaining something that is religious. It violates separation of church and state. And in a 7-2 opinion, the Supreme Court said last year, no, the cross can stay. It doesn't have to be removed. It can stay. Now, their reasoning for that is less than ideal for Christians. Their reasoning is that the cross can have a secular meaning. Now, some Christians would strongly disagree with that and say that the cross always has an overtly religious meaning. But they said it can have a secular meaning, and in this case it did, because what happened, they said, was people saw these crosses for dead relatives and friends and people overseas who had died in the war. That cross reminded them of their sacrifice. And so when they were setting up a monument that they could visit, since they couldn't all travel overseas to see that, they wanted a cross that looked similar to that. And so it wasn't an overtly religious thing pointing to Jesus, they claimed, but a reminder of those who sacrificed in the war. So that was the rationale they used. It wasn't dissimilar from a rationale they used in another case where in Greece, New York, where they opened their city council meetings with prayer. The town of Greece did, and a group sued the town of Greece, New York, saying you can't do that. And the Supreme Court upheld the prayer before the city council meetings. Again, a good result, but a less than desirable rationale saying that prayers could have a non-religious meaning, which is kind of a bizarre ruling, but that the purpose of the prayer was not to proselytize or force people to believe in Jesus, but the purpose of the prayer was to convey the solemnity of the meeting, to get people focused on the task at hand, and that in both of these cases, the tradition and the history of Christian prayer and monuments and things like that factored heavily into the Supreme Court's decision. So that goes kind of back to my opening remark or principle about not seeing reductions of religious privilege as this reduction of or an infringement on religious liberty. That basically what the court said is the privileged status Christianity has enjoyed throughout history, praying before meetings, having crosses up, things like that, actually plays into their favor, and we're going to allow these practices to continue. So one last topic I want to talk with you about regarding religious liberty, and this is good news for any of you who are ministers. And when I say ministers, I don't mean ministers under the ministerial exception. I don't mean an instrumentalist or administrative assistant or something like that. I mean licensed or ordained ministers. I mean ministers under the IRS. Those of you who claim housing allowance exemptions. Hopefully you know what a housing allowance is. It's a portion of your salary that you don't have to pay income tax on because it's designated to your salary, to your housing. It's similar to the parsonage exception. The parsonage exception is a house that's owned or property that's owned by the church or the organization that they allow that minister to live in. That's a benefit and usually would be a taxable benefit for another employee, but it is not taxable for churches. The problem with the parsonage exception is it favors certain denominations and it favors certain institutions that have property, that have houses, as opposed to, some of, for example, a hierarchical denomination may have a lot of property and a lot of houses that they can put pastors in. Baptists used to have a good number of parsonages, but not as much anymore. Sometimes Baptist churches meet in schools or movie theaters. They don't even own their own building for worship, let alone a house for the minister to live in. And so they're being excluded from that benefit. So what the housing allowance does is it says, okay, you may not be able to provide that minister an actual house, but if you provide them a portion of their income that goes towards a house, we're going to allow that to be tax-free as a benefit to them as well. And so we know that not every church can pay their minister a lot of money. You did not get into the business of ministry to try to get rich. You're serving the Lord and serving your calling, and so those tax-exempt dollars from your income go a long way. And so if that parsonage exception, the housing allowance was removed, or the parsonage exception was removed, that would be a really difficult thing for a lot of our ministers in their pocketbooks. And there was a challenge to it. There was a challenge from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, not Freedom of Religion, Freedom from Religion Foundation, an atheist group up in Wisconsin. They challenged that and said this is unconstitutional because our atheist ministers don't get the same benefit. And atheist minister sounds a little bit like an oxymoron to me, but that's the argument that they made. So they won at the trial court level, and then the appellate court, the circuit court, they threw it out. They said, you haven't even tried to apply for this benefit, so how do you know that you're being discriminated against? So they applied for the benefit, the IRS denied them the benefit, and so they went through the process again, and they won again at the trial court level. No surprise, it was the same judge. And then they tried again at the appellate level, and the appellate court had to decide on this again, this time on the actual merits of the case, not whether they had a right to complain. And the court said, no, the housing allowance does not violate the First Amendment. It's allowed to stay intact. Now, that's only an appellate court ruling for that jurisdiction. It's not a binding on the country at large, but something, and that was the Seventh Circuit, that was Wisconsin. But that was in March of 2019 that the appellate court said the housing exemption doesn't violate the First Amendment, the housing allowance stays. In June, that was when the Freedom from Religion Foundation had a deadline to appeal. They could have appealed it to the Supreme Court, to the United States Supreme Court, and they didn't. They let the deadline pass. They chose not to appeal. And in a press release and answering questions, they essentially said the makeup of the court isn't right. This isn't the time to challenge it, because they knew they would lose at the Supreme Court level. As I said earlier, Supreme Court is very pro-liberty. That includes pro-religious liberty. Our court has consistently sided on behalf of churches and ministers and those asserting religious liberty claims, at least under our current Chief Justice. The Roberts Court has done that. And so they didn't even appeal. So right now, the challenges to the housing allowance are dead. They're stopped. That's not to say that a challenge couldn't come up in another circuit, the Ninth Circuit maybe, or a different circuit, Second Circuit, something like that. But currently there aren't any. And I'm confident that if it got taken to the Supreme Court, at least as currently constituted, the housing allowance would be there to stay. So continue claiming those housing allowances, continue enjoying and benefiting from those right now, without the fear that those are going to be ruled unconstitutional, at least for now. Just again, another promotion of religious liberty and freedom, not taxing the housing of our ministers. So those are, I know that's kind of a catch-all. It's kind of some miscellaneous issues that are going on right now, but that kind of catches you up to date on some of the religious liberty issues, at least as they're being applied with legal challenges and in courts. And again, I'm an attorney, and so that's what I know. And so I hope you have a good Independence today, and I hope that you appreciate on this Independence Day the brilliance of our First Amendment, the brilliance of a country that has it's not perfect, but has the best system that we know of for balancing the rights and liberties of individuals, including our religious liberties and our freedom of expression and freedom of worship. And so we're grateful for those opportunities. We're grateful for those who fought and continue to fight for us to have those religious liberties. So I hope you appreciate those, appreciate your Southern Baptist heritage, appreciate all of the work Baptists have done to contribute to this amendment and these freedoms and the continued freedoms we enjoy today. And thanks a lot for your time. I hope I get to see you in person again real soon.